is once you enter into an alliance like the NATO alliance, you may be dragged into conflicts where you don't want to go. And you start proving yourself that you are providing an option which is an alternative to China, far more reliable, far more secure, and far less interfering. You were trying to push back Chinese aggressiveness by possibly trade or by interlocking the economies, which is what India was also doing with China.
Hello and welcome to my channel. This is Aadi. Today I'm privileged to be joined by Maj Gen Harsha Kakar, who is going to explain to us in entirety what is the Quad. The Major General, who was commissioned into the Indian Army in 1979, has held various different positions in the Indian Army all over the country. Today, he's a strategic thinker and a writer concerning various strategic issues for India. Thank you, sir, for joining us today in the evening.
Pleasure.
And we hope for your wise inputs with regards to the Quad. Sir, let me just start with a very, very basic question. What is the Quad and how did the idea actually come up?
See, the Quad initially came up as a humanitarian support organization post the tsunami in 2004. Initially, the intention was to provide relief basically to those who were affected by the tsunami. The idea came out from the Japanese Prime Minister and it spread from there. Subsequently, then it grew into a grouping of 4 nations, basically involving military exercises in addition to humanitarian relief. In between, somewhere when the pressure from China built up, Australia backed out, wanted to rejoin again. But then the Indo-China relations were running well, and India was not keen to try and get on the wrong side of China by conveying a grouping against China. So India kept Australia out. The meetings at the official level were kept to the Joint Secretary, and at that level, India was not keen to raise the level basically on account of Chinese objections. So it remained like that till Doklam. Doklam was the time when India realized that the Indo-China relations are not going to come back on a normal key. And salami slicing will be, the aggressiveness of China is going to be there for display. And it's going to be a continuous process. So India then decided to raise the levels. And that is how it came down to the foreign secretary level and then to the foreign minister level. And finally, then Australia was brought back in. And it remained a military alliance per se. And it was the first time now that the 4 heads of state of the Quad nations met in that virtual conference, which was chaired by Joe Biden. Now, the question is that the Quad so far has been more of a military organization. Its intentions, as it has stated even in the conference, was basically the Indo-Pacific. Now, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, you're going to consider the ASEAN nations, you're going to consider the Indian Ocean, you're going to consider the South and East China Seas. But if you don't have the ASEAN nations on your side, then a military grouping towards China without involving those who are directly into conflict with China really doesn't make sense. Currently, if you look at it, all the 4 nations have had something or the other against China. India-China standoff continues. Japan-China, there is the fight over the Senkaku Islands, which the US, as per treaty with Japan, is duty-bound to defend. So it's not going to be easy for China to take that. Australia has got its trade biffs with China. The US has got a competition with China, both in the military and technological field. So that sort of a situation is continuing. But if the Quad has to be effective, then it has to move from a purely military angle to a diplomatic and economic angle, and which is what this current conference signified. If you look at the statements that followed post the conference, there was a meeting on the issue, there was a reference to ASEAN, that their problems need to be resolved as per international laws. There was a mention of South and East China Sea, there was a mention of the Indo-Pacific. So basically, it's expanded beyond that. Then the 4 other things that came out of it. The vaccine diplomacy, where you're going to challenge China in its own backyard, which is as far as the ASEAN nations are concerned, the Indian Ocean region nations are concerned, the Pacific smaller countries are concerned. So this was one. Then the other takeaway on the technology aspect, we are looking at countering China in terms of the technology, basically where it currently stands as far as 5G is concerned, as far as the other aspects, because all the nations, all the four nations have faced cyber attacks from China. So you're looking at diversifying the supply chains from China. So now it's actually become a grouping which has got a direction, which has got something to look forward to. It's got clear cut aims. It is not solely military, it's expanded beyond the military field. So, thereby, it's now going to be a more powerful grouping in a position to challenge China in every sphere of dominance which China has got in the region and thereby push it back.
So, mainly, you mentioned in the beginning part of your answer that the Quad was inactive for a long time. We all know that was a big mistake. My question to you is that wasn't a belligerent and aggressive China actually seen through by the members or the community of the Quad at that time? Weren't the think tanks actually telling them?
See, the question was that at that time, if you look at individual nations, Japan was looking to go in for a trade deal with China. You were trying to push back Chinese aggressiveness by possibly trade or by interlocking the economies, which is what India was also doing with China. I mean, our economies were interlocked to a large extent, so much so that the trade imbalance was in China's favor. The
Correct.
same was the case with the US. Same was in fact, for Australia, China was the largest trading partner. Now, if you look at it, Australia and Japan are also members of the RCEP, which is basically an ASEAN created organization or a free trade zone, which has been pushed by China. So basically, what you were at one time contemplating was to try and offset the aggressiveness by economic links. But that did not work out with all the four nations. China is the largest trading partner, whether you take India, Japan, Australia, or the US. So when you realize that that was not going to cool down the aggressiveness of China, that is when the military aspect began taking into sphere. And then, of course, the Chinese aggressiveness in the South China Sea, when it claimed almost a large part of it, almost the whole of it, and through which most of the global trade grows. So that also got impacted, plus demands for islands which belong to other nations, whether it's the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Indonesia, it was with all. So that is when they realized that you now need to get into a military sort of a sphere to push back the Chinese. India hesitated because till 2017 we did not want the Wuhan or the Sabarmati spirit which had been created, or the Mahabalipuram spirit which had been created over the years, to be pushed back. So we were trying to keep it on an even key. And though the US wanted us to join in and enhance the scope, we were the ones who were hesitating.
So, but a lot of the naysayers to this Quad would actually say that this is a US plan to push us against the Chinese, and for the fact that we are the only country who literally shares a border with the Chinese. The Japanese are close by, but there is obviously the US protection. What the naysayers have to say is that the US would never come for India's help, but it would do the same for the Japanese. How do you take that particular thing, sir?
The first thing is that this is not an alliance. This is not an Asian NATO. The reason being, India does not want to enter into an alliance is once you enter into an alliance like the NATO alliance, you may be dragged into conflicts where you don't want to go. NATO countries are all there in Afghanistan. They remain there. While the US has got 2,500 to 3,500 troops, NATO's got about 10,000. So the NATO, so if you're looking at it, you can be dragged into conflicts. So you're not looking at it as an alliance. Secondly, as far as even the Indo-China border issue came up, India said we don't need anyone here. But what you needed was technology, which you got. What you needed is the latest in terms of weapons and equipment, which you can procure, which you're getting. So that sort of a support, which earlier would not be forthcoming, is now forthcoming. Now, what you needed otherwise in terms of this sort of support, you needed diplomatic support, you needed economic support, all that is flowing through. You do not want support when it comes down to ground battles because we're capable of handling it ourselves. But at the same time, what you need in today's world, no nation, irrespective of its power, even the US, can defend all its interests by itself. It needs allies. So India also as a nation needs allies. We're not looking at getting involved into like India is not taking part in the FONOPS, or which is the freedom of navigation operations in the South or East China Sea under the US command. We don't operate like that. If we have to do anything, we do it ourselves. If our naval ships have to sail, they sail on their own. They don't sail under command anyone else. So you're looking at allies, but you're not looking at an alliance as of now.
Mm.
Okay, so there is a difference there. And no nation can operate on its own. The entire world depends on allies, no matter who it is.
That's interesting. So basically, what you're saying is just a grouping which is formed to help each other out.
It's a grouping formed to support each other, possibly in case, say, of an Indo-China conflict. Uh, with the deployment of forces from the Quad in the Indian Ocean region or in the South China Sea, the Chinese Navy would not be able to dominate the Indian Ocean region. Right, so you're going to get something there. After all, the grouping of Quad, you've got to realize, is not an army per se event. It's more of a naval-based force. It is basically to ensure that your sea lines of communication are clear. This is where you would possibly get some amount of support. It may not mean that they're going to join you in operations there, but the fact that their presence is there is enough to give you that sort of a support which you need in such an environment. Right. And that is where it is. And plus, on top of it, you're going to get the support in terms of the way we are getting it now and what we wish to procure, which even 5, 7 years before was nowhere on the cards. So a lot of it changes as your relationships with nations change.
Mm. So with the involvement of the heads of state into the squad right now, and it has pretty much jumped quite a lot of levels. What kind of a message would have gone to China? Although it is, I mean, these four states are democracies and they would put out their statements, but we all know these statements don't have the entire meat. What do you think the Chinese are looking at these four heads of states meeting, and what is going through their mind?
See, the four heads of state, when they met, the statement that was issued by the US. The four heads of state published an article together under all their names as one article in the Washington Post. This actually conveyed what the Quad was. It is more than just a military alliance. It is looking to counter China in every field, whether it's economic, whether it's supply chain management, whether it's vaccine diplomacy. So the intention is to push back against China everywhere. Like I said in my initial comments, that a military alliance alone would not have given the desired results. To give you a small example, the Philippines and South Korea are both strong US allies. None of them have looked at joining in on Quad. None of them have looked at supporting the Quad. Because as far as the ASEAN nations today are concerned, the fear is that if the Quad moves in, it would enhance tensions in the area, which would be detrimental to them. It will compel them to choose sides between the Quad nations and China, which would add to their problems. So therefore, they were steering themselves clear of both sides. But now, when you go beyond the military sphere, you go into economic, you go into diplomacy, you go into vaccines, and you start proving yourself that you are providing an option which is an alternative to China, far more reliable, far more secure, and far less interfering.
Mm.
You would find that there would be a change coming in the region in the next few months. Because the aim is to push these four study groups that have been formed uh, into acting before or completing their role even before the next head of states meet, which should be by the end of this year, before the end of this year. So, and as far as the vaccines are concerned, India is to produce them by the end of 2021. Sorry, by the end of 2022. So, which means that we will get into production of the 2 billion vaccines as fast as possible. Now, this is going to be distributed. So, automatically, what you're doing is you're pushing back the Chinese in every sphere. And that is where it is being far more than just military. You're now looking to change the environment in the region and thereby pull in these nations towards you rather than leaving them on the sidelines or on the Chinese side. So
mm.
that is why you find that you've changed the concept of Quad as to what happened in this meeting, because it was the military aspect that was being discussed earlier.
So basically, I don't know how to put it across, but I'm going to still take a little liberty and use the word called cohesive diplomacy. We're not really putting a gun on somebody's heads, but by doing these steps, is that what the end game is?
The end game is to win them over. One. Number two is even the US allies which are there in the region. The aim is to now pull them towards this direction. The more they come towards this, the more China gets isolated. So that is what the overall intention is.
Hmm. With regards to the output that came out from this big meeting, did you expect a little more, or do you think it is online or what is required to come out of the Quad at this moment?
At this moment, I think what they've achieved is far more than what was expected. I mean, I didn't visualize them getting into the diplomacy or the technological field. I mean, climate change is one part which is Biden's favorite, so that will keep coming in. But the technology and vaccine diplomacy are two aspects which were not expected to come out, but the fact that they've come out itself indicates that the Quad is looking at going beyond where it is currently. There was not much of talk on the military aspect because you already have that within the Quad. But
Hmm.
what you've been able to pursue, you've also got to realize that, you see, the nations of the four nations that form the Quad have got their own areas of interest. Now, the areas of interest currently don't match. For India, it's the Indian Ocean. For the Australians, it's the South Pacific. For the Japanese and the Americans, it is the South and East China Sea. Right. So you got to come down on that, which will come through with time. That's one. Secondly, you look at the force levels. The Australians will be able to provide you with possible 1 to 2 warships. Right. So would the Japanese. So the main force levels in this region are going to flow from India and the US.
Hmm.
So as and how this picture would play out. So now what you're now doing is you're looking at pushing back the Chinese in the spheres in which they had the maximum power. One was technology, as far as and the other was vaccine diplomacy, as well as now economic. Now you might find very shortly the Quad announcing some sort of economic support coming into the nations that need it, as against approaching China. So you
Hmm.
would find that coming in possibly at the next phase. So thereby what you're doing is you're pushing back the BRI, you're pushing back Chinese funding, you're pushing back Chinese vaccines, you're pushing back Chinese technology, and you're pushing back Chinese supply lines. So this is where exactly the Quad is currently heading. So which is far beyond just the military sphere in which it was.
So the two words which we talked about, vaccine and technology, seems quite reminiscent of what we are discussing at a national level in India as well.
Correct.
Uh, do you think it's a game plan which is done by us with regards to going against the Chinese? Because it smells of a very Indianized version of a focus point.
Not necessarily, because even see the first point as far as technology is concerned, because you're basically looking at the impact of cyber warfare.
Hmm.
Now, most of the supply chain coming in into whether it is the power sector or the telecom sector is flowing in from China. Now, this is where the study group is trying to offset that aspect by enlarging the supply chain, because all the four nations have faced cyber attacks from China. So that is what you're trying to offset. Not only the four, but every other nation in the region has faced that. So that is what you're trying to offset, number one. Number two, when you're looking at vaccine, India is not fighting a vaccine war because the demand for Indian vaccines is far more across the globe than the Chinese vaccine.
Hmm.
And India is possibly amongst the only states which, in addition to catering for its own, is supplying it across the globe. Most other countries, especially the westernized world, is accumulating as many vaccines as they can gather only for their people rather than supplying across.
Hmm.
So India is not looking into it. The demands are already high. But the fact is that we have the largest vaccine production capacity. Now, to enlarge that production capacity, to enhance the level of production, is where the US and Japanese are now pitching in. So the production will be in India, the funding will be from the US and Japan, and the distribution will be by Australia. Right. So it's going to be a combined effort of the Quad, and it's going to target nations in the ASEAN belt. It's going to target nations in the Indo-Pacific and in the South Pacific. So the regions where China is now looking to push in is exactly the regions where you're going to counter.
Building favors. So that is where the entire story lies, because at the end of it, that's the way the Chinese have been able to control these nations in obviously a little more aggressive manner. So my main thing, there has been a lot of trespassing been done through the South China Sea. The French have sent a warship, submarine. I'm sorry. The US obviously has been trespassing around. They've put a second carrier there. With seeing no particular response from the Chinese, except for zooming across a couple of aircrafts and making their statements through the wolf warriors. What do you interpret out of the response the Chinese are giving in terms of the naval power of the Chinese?
See, they are claiming that their navy, which is likely to be the largest navy as far as the world is concerned, but technologically it is still not strong. The aircraft carriers have got problems. The ships have got. I mean, you still don't have the trained crew or the ability to really move it as a blue water fleet, the way the U.S. Navy moves. So that's still way behind. But the fact is that they're not in a position to challenge the U.S. Navy. They keep claiming that they've got the aircraft carrier destroyer missiles, as they call it, which they claim to also have deployed along. But they are unwilling to carry out any challenge. The US actions have restricted them from attempting anything against whether it's Taiwan or whether it's any other island or further development of any islands there. Their freedom of navigation is being curtailed by the US Navy, which is floating in the area. So these actions are actually applying pressure on the Chinese to keep pulling back and keeping them at their doorstep, not letting them move out too far. So that is happening, and that is the sort of pressure which the Chinese are feeling now, because they know they're not in a position to challenge the US naval power as of now.
So my question now, there are two things that you mentioned. One, we mentioned about these islands being created in the South China Sea. The second part, we also talked about the fact that we were trying to, in a simple way, if I may put it, appease China through the trade deals and interlinking the economies. I'm sure we were also, the Quad nations and the world was also seeing the construction of these islands. And did we realize that, a posture which is taken in such a strong manner by the Chinese in this would result in some sort of a standoff in the future?
See, as far as the South China Sea is concerned, the islands that they had fortified, they'd done it there, and that time the US had kept quiet. That time Barack Obama was there. They managed to get that done. They pushed it through. No one took the Chinese very seriously, but by the time you realized, and like salami slicing, they moved on it very quietly, kept working on it, and they kept creating them. Now, when the impact of it came in is the time when you realized, and when they started claiming the islands of other nations, whether it's the Philippines, whether the Vietnamese, whether the Japanese or the Indonesian, that is when the world started waking up and the world started now countering China. Philippines even went down to the ICJ and they got their verdict there, but China refused to adhere to it. So that is the time when the world started standing up. Now, as far as India is concerned, those islands in the South or East China Sea did not really impact us. The impact started coming in when you started claiming the whole of the South and East China Sea, which implied that it impacted your ships moving in. We had oil exploration deals with Vietnam. Now that started coming into play because China started claiming those regions as belonging to it. And that is when our ships continued moving to Vietnam and out, and we still do. We don't operate under the US, but we do our own visits to Vietnam and other areas which China claims belong to it, despite any Chinese naval warnings which keep coming from there. But these are things that keep happening. But the fact is that by the time you realized it and you started acting, you let China do certain amount of construction, but those were the islands which China considered its own. The claims on other islands, it still continues to claim them. It hasn't grabbed any of them yet. But that threat of claim is where the world is now waking up to prevent them from grabbing.
So main thing, if one actually looks at a map of China, especially the eastern part of China, one actually realizes that its access to the blue water, which is the Pacific Ocean, is very limited. If uh, it's quite congested in that area. For becoming a superpower, it would want that access to be free and clear and open for their own trade purposes and whatever else they want to do. One main thing that comes out of this is that the Chinese have not been able to develop their navy as per what they wanted to say and what they projected themselves to be. Whereas the army and the air force is on a path of pretty of a good stand today. Because of this lack of access and its shortened hand in the naval power, as you just mentioned, with regards to their carriers and their technology not being right, do you think Chinese feel shortchanged with their own game plan?
No, you see, China initially developed its land force. Once the PLA was strong enough, then it went in for its air power. Now the concentration has shifted to the PLAN, the PLA Navy.
Okay.
You also got to realize that whatever manpower they cut short in the army, they moved it to the PLA Navy. So thereby the entire force build-up now is the PLA Navy. Their rate of production of ships, what we produce in 6 years, they produce in a year. So the rate, and today I think as far as the number of ships are concerned, they are far more than what the US also holds. The question is see, it takes time. You may build ships, but then to train your naval personnel to operate the ships takes time. To get the ships to operate as a fleet takes time. To build up that capability of a blue water fleet again is a time factor. So these are the things, these are the phases in which the Chinese are going in. It's not that the Chinese Navy is weak. You've got to realize that in terms of number of ships, they're even greater than the US today. It's the largest naval fleet. The question is the cohesiveness of the fleet, the level of training of the fleet, and I am not very certain on the level of technology available with them. Because in most cases, whether it's the air power or whatever, these are copied technologies. How effective is it now? We really don't know. But the fact is, if you look at the number of ships, it's far greater. It's, I think, got the largest navy in the world at the moment.
Yes. So basically, what they're trying to do is the great old Chinese game of numbers. You know, the waves and numbers of their weapons.
I wouldn't say that. I'd say give them a few years, and if they're not curtailed now or not pushed back now, you might find that the Chinese Navy would be a match for the US Navy in a few years from now. So that is what is a concern as far as the US is concerned.
Fair enough. So there was a recent US naval report that came out which talked about the Chinese attacking Taiwan within the next 6 years. That's a big claim because, and one can see that happening with regards to the increased focus on Taiwan, especially once they moved off from Ladakh. Their rhetoric has been much harder towards Hong Kong and Taiwan itself. Where do you see the situation going?
6 years possibly may be too long. It may be even faster. That is what they would attempt, which is what the US is going to deny. Because if you've got to look at it, during the time of Barack Obama, they created those islands. During the time of Trump, they changed the entire scenario in Hong Kong. Will they do something in the time of Biden as far as Taiwan is concerned? Because you've got to remember that if it has to clear Taiwan, if it goes in for an air warfare, it's going to face retaliation not only from the small Taiwanese Air Force, but also from the US. A land invasion is not going to be easy. So the question is, how will it get Taiwan to move? Or how will it get Taiwan to bend? So that is where the question arises. And let's see how it goes, because I think 6 years possibly may be too long. I don't think Xi is going to wait 6 years if he wants to go in for Taiwan.
So you see that happening sooner, and maybe a possible localized flashpoint in that region?
Could be.
So for something like that to happen, obviously the Chinese are going to focus themselves on to probably presenting a whole viewpoint and changing the narrative as per se, which they are brilliant at doing. How do you think that they would bring this across to Taiwan, except the same old rhetoric that this is a part of China and this and that? Because the world does see through it. They also know that the pushback they're going to get from the United States. Do you think at this moment or in the next 2-3 years that you're saying, they would be ready for such a conflict?
The Chinese would be because their one full command is based facing Taiwan, massive force levels. Every day there are flights over Taiwan airspace, almost on a regular basis. I think in the month of January or February, they had more flights than they had last year. So there is a sort of a feeling that almost daily they are threatening Taiwan.
Hmm.
The question is it only a threat to tell Taiwan not to announce independence or to look at it in some other way or a warning to Taiwan? It's yet got to be seen because the world has got to ensure that Taiwan doesn't go the way Hong Kong has gone. So the world is going to be wary. That is one of the reasons why there's always a large presence of US forces in the region. And the aim is to keep pushing back at China to prevent it from taking this step. So while the Chinese would be desirous of doing it, the question is, will the world let them do it?
Mm.
And after all, China's got to choose the time right because in case they try and they don't succeed, then it's going to bounce back very heavily on the Chinese. So that is the other aspect. So they're going to choose it right. They're going to try and build an internal narrative because the narrative has to be more internal than external because external, nobody is going to listen.
Mm.
So they have to build an internal narrative that this is what the thing is and this is what we plan to do. So that is the stage that we're looking to see.
So there are other countries that have interest in the Pacific and the South China Sea, namely France, Germany, uh, which are of course part of the NATO as well. Do you see that the addition of EU into the Quad as a Quad plus sort of a scenario somewhere down the line is a wise idea?
See, as it is, the Quad, France and UAE will be carrying out joint exercises shortly, or they already have, or they're going to do it soon. The question is whether they join formally into the Quad, into a Quad plus, or it remains, or they operate independently because of their own interests. The French have also got bases in the Indian Ocean. They've got the Reunion Islands. So with their bases there, and all other nations which are dealing with trade in the Indo-Pacific want to ensure their own trade routes are clear, and they do not want the Chinese sort of interference. Which is why a number of nations, not only France, Germany, but you're also finding Britain, you're finding even the Netherlands, talking about the Indo-Pacific, because this is now becoming a major reason of concern, mainly because of the Chinese aggressiveness. So as you find a larger influx of ships in the region, you're going to find that the flashpoint in the Indian Ocean or in the Indo-Pacific is likely to be building up with passage of time. How will this play out with China? Will it push back the Chinese? Let's see how it goes.
Mm. That's very interesting. I think it's going to become a world problem, and it's high time that it needs to be addressed. Sir, one last question. There is obviously Chinese interest in this entire region. They're building naval force, but the Chinese, we all know, are not silly enough to literally push back against half the world for their own purpose. What are the Chinese options against the Quad at this moment with regards to diplomacy and the heads of state getting involved in it?
See, the question that is there is the nations that are beholden to China on account of its funding. Right. That is where the difference comes in. Now, for those nations to switch is not easy. That's number one. Number two is these are the nations who, if they don't repay, China would take their assets, including their naval bases, to expand their outreach, their reach. So you're going to find that coming up. The third aspect is possibly a change in pattern of Chinese funding in terms of support to these nations. Basically, if you look at it as far as ASEAN is concerned, almost all of them have got a trade imbalance with China.
Mm.
With the RCEP, it's going to only build up further. Now, how is China going to exploit this? Second is, as how will these nations view the Quad in terms of support against China? Because for them, the arrival of the Quad is enhancing tensions with China, which is threatening their economic development. How are they going to view this? Will they switch sides? Will they stay neutral? Currently, even the Philippines and South Korea are neutral. Are they going to maintain that line? Are they going to start moving closer to the Quad? You've got to, we've got to see it the way the present context of the last meeting plays out on ground in the coming months. If it plays out well, you might find a change in outlook of these nations. If it doesn't play out well, then you might find that the nations remain the way they are. And the Quad will continue to play its role. So that is something which is going to now start flowing out. Plus, you'll find that the Japanese may possibly get involved in investing more in these regions in terms of trade or providing them loans as a counter to China. You might find the US getting involved in that. So you might find a lot of change coming in and the focus coming in on ASEAN, because as far as the statements were concerned, there were 2 or 3 references made to ASEAN.
Yes.
Basically on the centrality of ASEAN, the security of ASEAN, a lot of issues are coming up as far as ASEAN nations are concerned. So when you look at that factor, the fact is that the Quad is shifting its focus towards ASEAN, may possibly lead to the ASEAN changing its thought process of its neutrality and possibly moving closer. So if that happens, there'll be a world of a difference. This is still early stages after the meeting. The way it's going to play out, the way things are going to move forward is the way we're going to see how things go.
I think that's been a wonderful talk, sir. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I think the entire force that has been collected together, and this, when I use the word force, is really not military as per se, is military diplomacy, as you say, and the heads of state getting involved into it. The vaccinations, which are going to become a big talking point within this part of the world. I agree with you in this entire thing, and India will play a very central role. Thank you so much for your view, sir. And I think all of us who are going to listen to this are going to benefit from this.
Thank you.
And I'll request you once again, as soon as some other developments are on with regards to Quad, we'll connect again and try and get your views as to how this thing is going to open out.
Done. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Bye. Bye. Take care. Bye.